You cannot just work on an idea because it's a good idea, or because you think you would be a good fit for it, or because you just in your heart desperately really want to be an entrepreneur because you think that's what's going to make you fulfilled. You have to actually meet the bar of, am I going to be passionate enough that when this gets really hard, I'm going to keep doing it? And that's like one of multiple bars that you have to meet to build a company.
Gagan, welcome to the show. It's your day to be in the spotlight. We're so happy to have you here on the show. We have I would say, an interesting past as co-conspirators in the online learning space, as entrepreneurs who had we shared some investors across our last projects. I've been watching your work from afar for some time. You got a bunch of cool stuff going right now. I'm very excited for you to share your world with our audience today.
Thanks, Chase. Yeah, I feel the same way. We've definitely crossed paths so many different ways, and really appreciate you having me on the show.
Awesome. Well, one of the ways that I like to start, I've got a couple ways into the show, and my favorite is to ask the guest how they describe themselves and their own work to the audience, so that if there are some people who might not be familiar with your work, that they can sort of grok where you're coming from. So let's start there. Maybe you can share a little bit about yourself and the work you do in the world, and that'll be our kickoff.
The dreaded self-bio. I love being put on the spot. So I consider myself an entrepreneur for my work. I was very lucky that when I was about 21, so right out of college, I discovered that this was a possible career path. Until that date, I literally had no idea you could be an entrepreneur. And despite growing up in Silicon Valley, ironically. And so when I figured out it could be a career path, I started to explore it, and I ended up starting Udemy. I met the people who had the idea for Udemy, Aaron and Oktay, my co-founders, and decided to work on it with them. I've also at times dabbled in journalism. I did write for TechCrunch. I ran a conference business. I worked as a leader, a marketing advisor leader at Lyft. I started a food delivery company. That was my second startup. And now I'm co-founder CEO at Maven, which is a online learning company focused on live cohort-based courses. So kind of similar to Creative Live in a lot of ways, but focus on multi-session courses where you might meet your fellow learners over 3 to 5 to 10 sort of sessions in a row, and then learn a subject like maybe conversational AI products or ChatGPT for finance or product management.
Awesome. Well, that is a good table setting. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to say how I know you specifically. If I botch this, you jump in and correct me, because I'm known to get some of the details wrong on these. But my awareness of you is, of course, through Udemy. Creative Live and Udemy were amongst the earliest learning platforms out there. They had different, ours were, Udemy was more of a platform where people would come on and teach classes, and you enabled a lot of other people to teach. And Creative Live was a little bit more, we handpicked people and made specific things. We had a live component at that point. You didn't. So I was aware of Udemy in the ecosystem, and you specifically as one of the co-founders. But the rubber really met the road when you were already on to your second company, which was Sprig, the one that you mentioned, the food delivery company. And an investor that was on my board was interested in investing in you, and said, "Oh, I think he passed my name on to you as a reference." And we talked, and I remember, God, I really like that guy. He's sharp and interested, and he's asking the right questions about investors. And I think he's going to go do some awesome things with Sprig too. And what I see now in Maven, to touch on each of the sort of the cornerstones that you mentioned, Udemy, Sprig, and now Maven, I think it's fascinating. And this is one of the areas I actually want to sort of back into your career. I want to start where you are now working on Maven, because I think the people who are listening and watching they wouldn't be here if they didn't seek to learn from all these, various media sources and the experts in the world who now we have access to in a way that we didn't a decade ago. And given that I think Maven is really interesting, I'm curious if you could sort of make a case for why cohort-based is the thing that you all are over-indexing on at Maven. Why do you believe deeply in that? And what's the pitch for someone who's curious?
Yeah, so Maven's vision is to be the university of the future. And our idea is that if we can bring the world's experts, like people like you, obviously experts in product management, design, engineering, and ideally even things like parenting eventually, right? Live online to teach other people, that'll be a huge opportunity for us in education. But I think the main thing that's unique about Maven, as you said, is cohort-based. So what makes cohort-based interesting? Well, first and foremost, accountability. It's very surprising, but as you and I both know, video-based courses have like a 4 to 10% completion rate. And while I think that can be overstated as a negative, it's not as bad as it sounds, it still is a sort of damning statistic. And what it means is that people often have an intent to learn something, but learning is really hard. It forces you to look in the mirror. It forces you to get through a lot of rough patches where you don't know how to solve a problem. You're doing something new. And the accountability of a cohort dramatically improves that experience. And so if you think about the human element of learning, just the reality of like, you aren't just going through a textbook like a robot would, you're going through a textbook like a human would, which means that you get stuck, you stop, you have questions, you need to see other people do it to believe you can do it. A cohort provides that. And so accountability is probably the number one benefit. The second benefit is that it allows you to get your questions answered and unstuck. And it allows you to be more doing focused. Cohorts by nature force you to produce materials because you have to share them with other people in the cohort. It forces you to speak up because you might get split off into a breakout room where you have to speak with other people. And so there's an interactive component in a cohort-based course that doesn't exist in a video-based course. And those are really the reasons why I think it's just a much more effective learner experience.
Interesting. When I think back to Creative Live's early days, it was largely, the business model was, from the outside at least, it was, oh, cool, they're broadcasting these classes for free and on a schedule, and I can watch and participate in those for free if I'm doing that when they are airing. And yet, if I want to have access to that course in the future, or if I want to watch some of the videos or do some of that work on my own time, then I have to own it. So as what I learned with that process is that's a compelling mechanism to get people to buy. It's generous because, at the outset, it's free. And there is a cohort component to it because everyone's in this live class together, and we were in fact taking questions from all over the world, and so it had many of the attributes that you're talking about, but specifically it's different. And I'm wondering if this idea of meeting regularly at some sort of interval, do you feel like that weeds out a bunch of people who are maybe not serious, or who for whom this sounds too scary, and it's that weeding process that creates a better environment and a better result, a better, aligns a bunch of interested learners? Or what specifically about scheduling it out do you feel like, is super helpful? And I'm asking this specifically because I think our listeners are curious about the value of this in a world where they can watch any video at any time they want. This breaks that paradigm. As an entrepreneur, I'm interested in it, but I'm dying to hear from you. Like, what does that make a more dynamic? Are you selecting, or what's the is there some additional or hidden benefits there?
Well, one of the most important things is that there is a curriculum, and it's kind of it's unexpected benefit, but it's very difficult to learn everything you need to learn in just one session. It requires learning something, then going and maybe practicing it or digesting it and then coming back. So one of the benefits of a cohort is, and multiple sessions, is actually an individual benefit. It's not about the group yet. I'll talk about that in a second. But it's just that, hey, if you want to learn, how to manage your product management career, the best thing you can do is dedicate multiple sessions to it and sort of say, and go through the multiple steps. Like maybe there's 5 different lectures here that you need to go through, and that's important. So that's one benefit of a cohort versus like episodic live content. The second benefit is this project-based sort of interactive approach. You interact with your peers more and you build a relationship if you see them multiple times. And if you see the instructor multiple times, the same instructor multiple times. And so whereas with an episodic situation like Creative Live, you might have a relationship with Creative Live, and you certainly are going to have a relationship with you, Chase. You may not have a relationship with the instructor who's teaching that course because you may not actually go to every one of their events in a row, and it's not part of what you're buying per se. Whereas at Maven, you're always buying a multi-session relationship with this instructor that you can go deep with. And then finally, it is about the multi-session approach has as much to do with what happens in between the sessions. So it's very much a part of the experience to do a project or to sort of have a discussion offline in an offline community with the same group over the 2 to 4 week period during which you're taking one of these courses. And so it's an odd thing, right? Psychology is odd because at the end of the day, we don't always understand. It's not always logical why people react a certain way. And so I'm giving you a multiple factor answer. There's multiple things that go into it, but the cohesive answer is actually the best. The cohesive answer is psychologically, people aren't thinking, oh, I'm going to take a cohort-based course, or I'm going to take a live course on Creative Live, or I'm going to take a video-based course on Udemy. What they're thinking is, oh, in 2 weeks, I'm going to learn from Shreyas Doshi on how to improve my career. I get it. All right, moving on. In that soundbite version, I think a cohort-based course is the most powerful because it just makes sense to people. It's what they're used to. It's how they learned in college, how they learned in school.
Okay. Let's put a pin in Maven specifically now, and let's go back. Let's go back to just learning. I think we share that in common, our fascination with it. The fact that you were a co-founder of Udemy, which, went on through lots of different incarnations, frankly speaking, a number of different CEOs, a bunch of different growth rounds. And, and then ultimately went public, did it not?
Yes, it did.
Yeah. So ultimately it went public, and I think we can all call that a success. So again, putting a pin in Maven, let's go back to your early interest in Udemy and or in learning generally. Like, why learning? Why were you fascinated with that? And then specifically, let's talk about that process of being the co-founder of a company that ultimately went public.
Sure. You want me to start with why learning?
Yeah, I want. You said you met your co-founders, that they were sort of starting to work on something and you got involved. And what was it like? Why learning of all the things that you could be an entrepreneur in? You cited a handful of different ones that you'd start a different, areas of interest early on, but why learning to do your first sort of major entrepreneurial adventure?
Well, I think that it's two things that created this sort of energy in me. One is that growing up, I loved learning. And I always learned, I always loved learning new things. My head was in a book for most of my youth. I was an avid chess player, soccer player, baseball, American football, just all sorts of different activities. I took piano, I took guitar, like whatever, everything, always learning both inside and outside of school. I was a very good student for most of my life. And then puberty hit and I became a teenager, and junior high and high school hit. And I started to realize that the emperors had no clothes, meaning that the teachers who were in charge of teaching me were not as effective as I thought I had sort of idolized teachers growing up, and I think I just sort of started to get really frustrated with my education. And there were a bunch of things. I went to a public high school that I think there was kind of a pseudo, struggle between the immigrant kids who are really high performing and the more quote unquote native, not native as a Native American, but like, white American or whatever, teachers who had grown up in a totally different society that did not care nearly as much as we did about SATs and getting into college and that kind of thing. And there was just this battle at school between these two groups. And I was at the forefront of this. I was in the principal's office over this battle. I was like, writing articles and getting kicked off the school newspaper. And so I basically just like started to get really upset at the system while still having this core passion for learning. And those two things collided in what has become a sort of lifelong journey for me, not just of learning, but also of teaching and building better learning experiences for the public and sort of trying to disrupt the existing system. So I think that's really why I want to change the system and why I want to build the next version of it.
Yeah, the classic adage is scratch your own itch, right? If it's not a passion, or if it's not a problem that's near to you, then you're not going to be as good at either solving that problem or applying effort when shit gets hard. And we all know, I guess at least you and I know it as entrepreneurs, that it does get hard. There's all kinds of places in a startup journey that are very, very difficult. Well, let's follow on that journey. So you were passionate about learning. You saw the system was failing some folks, and specifically you, that you weren't getting, you either getting treated differently or you had a different set of goals and values. The teachers, the emperors as they were, had no clothes. And so describe the story of how you actually went on board at Udemy, because the idea of, building anything and that is used by tens of millions of people is, especially looking backwards, like, wow, I noodled on this thing in a closet with a bunch of my friends for a while, and there's 10 million people or whatever, 50 or 100 million people started using it. That's an interesting journey. So describe your sort of onboarding, so people might get a sense of what it's like to go on that ride. First of all, again, identifying your passion, and then sort of pursuing that passion such that you took action and joined a startup and, again, ultimately took that company public.
Sure. It started when the recession happened in 2008. I was graduating college and I joined Accenture as my first job. I had already luckily secured the job before the recession started. But as I got closer to my start date and as I started working there, I realized that the company was really going through a pretty severe challenges because their business had dried up in the downturn. And so I started to worry that maybe I was going to be out of a job soon. Turned out to be a false concern. They kept all of us first-year associates, but that got me on the path of trying to find an alternative career path. And I eventually found TechCrunch and started to read voraciously about startups. And pretty soon I was like having all these startup ideas and I wanted to get into it. I started meeting people, and one fateful week in May, I ended up applying to TechCrunch to become an intern. And I applied to the Founder Institute to start a company through this startup incubator called the Founder Institute. And I got into both. And keep in mind, like I often I definitely did not expect to get into either of them. This was a very significant surprise to me. And I ended up deciding to do both that summer while I had my full-time job at Accenture. So it was a pretty wild time. And during the Founder Institute, I started, as many entrepreneurs do, with the idea of starting a test prep business. So, I knew how to hack the tests. I thought we could use the internet to teach test prep to kids. And that kind of went nowhere. I just couldn't find the right angle and didn't have the right partners. And so I was about to get kicked out of the incubator when the founder of the incubator gave me a call and was like, dude, Gagan, I'm going to kick you out if you don't go and meet these guys. Aaron and Oktai, they're really smart. They've got a cool idea, but they need a business co-founder like you. And so Adeo Resi, who's the founder of the Founder Institute, basically forced me to meet with them. And I got on Skype and met with Aaron and Oktai, and they demoed their product, which at that time, by the way, was a live learning platform. It was Zoom. It was basically a replacement for Zoom, or an early version of Zoom. And they built this beautiful live learning platform with a whiteboard and presentation sharing and everything else. And I was enamored by their technical capability, because at that point I had never met someone or really spent time with someone who could build that kind of sophisticated piece of software before. And so I decided to join them. And for a while, my job was basically to be the like American passport salesman of Udemy. I would sell to investors, I would sell to instructors, and try to get people, and to students, and try to get people to start adopting this product that we had built. And for 6 months, actually, I think it was almost a year, I couldn't get anyone to really adopt it. And we finally, maybe 9 months in, we finally decided, all right, screw it. This live video thing isn't going to work. And I was pushing for this idea of doing recorded videos, because while I couldn't get people to do live videos, I had found all these like libraries on the internet of like these really janky sites. I mean, you have to imagine this is like sites that look like Craigslist, okay? That just had large libraries of videos. They'd come out of universities, they'd come out of, random people on the internet who just decided that they were going to put up learning videos online. And this was before YouTube was even that big. I mean, YouTube was getting big, but still a lot of these videos were not on YouTube. They were just on websites. And slowly over time, I convinced my co-founders, look, we need to ditch this live learning platform. We got to do recorded courses. And we launched the site via recorded content, and it started to get some traction. And then slowly over time, another 6 months went by and it got some traction, but we couldn't get anyone to actually buy anything on the site. They were just watching the free content. And then we discovered coding courses. And when we finally discovered coding courses, that was the real unlock for Udemy. That was the day that, like, oh my God, I remember this intern being at our office. It was his first week. And he was like, I'm going to go start a course, because he saw how much money this instructor made off of a one-day, coding course. And then we were kind of off to the races. And coding really was what made Udemy successful. Was finding that niche that people really wanted to learn coding, and this new format was a great way to do it.
Fascinating. All right, so of the, you highlighted a handful of twists and turns in that share right there, and if I'm going to put myself in the listener's shoes, you have done it. You have started something, collaborated with others. What's missing from that story for me is that I'm curious about, and I think our listeners are curious about, is like, okay, you had an idea, you built a prototype, or you had some co-founders that could actually build things. And yet then how did you scale? You found a thing that was working presumably in a small, in a small-ish ecosystem. You said you got a coding class, but that doesn't really help people understand how you scaled an idea. And to be fair, you've now done this a couple of times, right? You built and scaled Udemy. You built and scaled Sprig, which was your food delivery service. And now you're doing the same with Maven. So clearly you have a skill of identifying this is worth scaling. And then you've gone out and you've raised money against that idea once you've sort of seen, the tea leaves or whatever. I'm hoping you can dive in and what are some of these signs that are in the tea leaves, and how did you go about basically raising money? Because there's a bunch of people listening right now like, I've got a great idea. I don't know how to, either get to a prototype, or what's the Gagan playbook? Because you've done it 3 times.
Sure. I think that it starts with having a vision. And this is the part that I think most people actually miss, is that you can't raise money and you can't build a successful company unless there's a destination that you're trying to get to that could be a big company. And most people, when I hear their ideas, their business doesn't have even the potential to make 100 million or 500 million in revenue, which is what it takes to build a company that's worth over a couple $1 billion, which is what it takes for a venture capitalist to want to invest. So it's perfectly fine to start a business that doesn't raise venture capital, has a different potential. I mean, I've started a conference business. It was a great conference. It made, hundreds of thousands of dollars and was a really satisfactory part of my career. But that business wasn't intended to have this big vision. It was just, hey, I'm going to do something now and it's going to be, it's going to be valuable for people. And I'm going to do it a couple of times and we'll see what happens. With Udemy, we always had the vision that it was going to be a big marketplace. I mean, we envisioned that it was going to be like YouTube or eBay or Odesk. Those were companies at the time that we could look at. And Odesk is now called Upwork. And so we always had this idea that, and so every step that we were taking along the way involved us either adapting the vision to it. So saying, oh, our old vision's actually not going to work. Our old vision was a bunch of live courses on this site. That's not going to work. We're going to do recorded courses. So that's an adaptation of the vision. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, does that vision still have the potential, if it was a really big company, to be hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue? And the answer was yes, but the answer could very well be no. The second option is not adapting the vision, but adapting the plan so that it still is along the path towards the vision, right? Imagine you and I are going on a walk, right, Chase? And if you ever visited me, this would be a very common thing I'd recommend us do. Like, especially if we had half a day together, I'd be like, Chase, why don't we just go for a walk? And I have an idea in my head of where that walk might end up. I kind of have a route. I'm in, let's say we're in San Francisco and we start in downtown. I know that eventually I want to end in Golden Gate Park because it'd be really fun to see the sunset, right? But there's so many different ways we could get to Golden Gate Park. We're not going to walk in a straight line, right? You'd walk through some really rough neighborhoods. You wouldn't really enjoy it. It'd be boring, and also it wouldn't be practical. It wouldn't be the point of the day. So but you still have to get to Golden Gate Park at the end. And I think one of the things that we did well at Udemy was when we realized that coding courses were going to be big, we didn't say, okay, now we're just going to rebrand the entire site, make it all about coding, and we're going to sell the public on coding courses and ignore the rest of the vision. We fit the coding courses into the vision. So those courses were clearly part of a marketplace where you could still learn business fundamentals. You could still get a, 48-hour MBA. You could still take courses on Photoshop, right? Courses that were not coding. So because we still held the vision in the future in our heads and then adapted our own execution towards that vision, we had a much higher likelihood of achieving it. And, funny enough, like our vision came true. Like most of what Udemy is today is, especially on the consumer side, is basically exactly what we were talking about 15 years ago when we started the company. And so I think that was a critical part, was having that destination and doing whatever it took, but in service to both getting to the next step while also making sure that that next step was going to get us to an eventual goal.
Let's introduce the concept now of getting other people to get excited about that destination, because this is another thing that you've done. So if you've created a vision 3 times and mapped out where we want to go, and we're not quite sure how to get there, we know it's not going to be linear. And by nonlinear, I mean 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I mean, we're going to, raise money. We're going to run some experiments. We're going to realize those experiments don't work. Then we're going to have to take a flat round or a down round. We're going to have to, lay off some people and change directions. Or if you're Golden Gate, bridge destination, we're going to realize that we walked 2 or 3 blocks out of our way. We're going to have to backtrack a little bit, or there was some road work, some construction. We had to take a left where we thought we could take a right. So it's a non-linear path. But how specifically do you think, okay, great, now my goal is to get other people excited about it, specifically people who can help us scale this vision, assuming people can meet the vision criteria that you just laid out?
Yeah. And by other people, you mean investors or employees?
Yeah, both. Because, that's if the goal is to build something and you're building in service of a vision, ultimately you're going to have to get other people excited about it. And the other
Yeah,
people, even if we just took you on face value, there, other employees or future, co-conspirators and venture capitalists or some other investor. It doesn't necessarily have to be Silicon Valley or venture capital. It could be, getting friends and family to invest in your, the pizza joint that you want to make or whatever. But getting
yeah,
people excited is required. Otherwise, no one's going to write you a check or sign on the dotted line to come work at a company if they don't, believe in what it is that you want to build. So how do you do that? That's the thing. I think it stops so many people. I've got a great idea. I believe deeply in it, but fuck, I'm stuck. I don't know where to go. How do I get other people excited about it besides my mom and my life partner, spouse, or whatever? How do I, attract investors, because it is $1 billion idea and I don't even know where to start.
yeah. It's a great question. I will say that there's some challenge here in explaining this because I didn't learn this. I naturally already was fairly good at the sales part of the business. And so what you're talking about fundamentally is sales, and it's selling the vision. And because I didn't learn it on the job, but I already knew kind of how to do it. It's a little harder to teach, but I'm going to do my best. So it starts by having a big vision. And I just want to reiterate that. I think a lot of people think they have a big vision and they don't, or they have a vision that's attractive to certain types of people, but not others. And you have to find the people who it is. So let's say you've done that. The next step is painting that picture and making it come to life. And there are a couple of key components of this. One is showing people what the future could look like if your business or your idea comes to fruition, right? So that could be anything from, in the case of Udemy, it was like, imagine a world where you could just go online, and if you had a need, like you needed to learn X, you needed to learn Photoshop to get a new job, you needed to learn design in order to, up level your skills in design. Let's say you wanted to learn how to write a PRD, which is a product requirements document in product. You could just go on this website, search for it, and you'd be able to pay $10, $50, $100, and you'd be able to get a course that would teach you that subject. Like, that was us sharing. We shared that vision with so many people, and most people thought we were a little crazy, didn't think it was possible, but every once in a while you meet someone who's crazy enough to believe you. And, and so that vision was sold heavily and clearly along the way. But then we also had to meet a couple other hurdles. Another hurdle is, what are the trends that show that this direction is actually possible? So what is happening today? What is the emergent behavior that will potentially show that this could be possible in the future? And so there were already a bunch of video-based learning sites that were starting to make, millions or tens of millions of dollars that we could point to and say, well, it's kind of like this. Like, there's a small group of people on the internet who are already spending money on these types of courses. Here's an example. The example at that time was Lynda. Lynda.com, Lynda, now known as got bought by LinkedIn. So it's LinkedIn Learning. Lynda was one of multiple companies that were good examples for us that we could use that showed this emergent behavior. Another example of emergent behavior was all these websites that were starting to pop up that I mentioned earlier in this episode about, essentially these link websites that would just have long links to videos of course content that was on the internet. So we had emergent behavior. We also used YouTube to prove emergent behavior, right? YouTube proved that people were willing to sit on their computer and just watch videos, which, by the way, until that point in 2009, when we were starting, was not that obvious. We also had to prove that online education was going to be a big thing. And so YouTube kind of helped prove that, but that was a big challenge. So we had to show the emergent behavior. And then the final thing is we had to show that there was practical traction towards the next steps. Like, you can't just go and sell people on an idea. I mean, some people do this. I think in the movie business, to some extent, they do this. They might actually just sell people on the idea of the movie, and they don't actually have that much traction. But usually they have something. They're looking for their first actor who's signed on. They're looking for they've got a screenplay that they can show. They've made some progress. In the business world, you have to make progress to prove anything to people, because people are not just asking the question of, is this possible? They're asking the question, is Gagan going to do it? Is Chase going to do it? Or should I go and talk to someone else about doing this idea? Maybe it's a great idea, but maybe Gagan doesn't have the stuff to make it happen. So Gagan's got to prove that he can do it. Aaron, my co-founder, had to prove it. And so we had to have a prototype. We had to have users, traction, people paying us money. And at each one of those hurdles, it was easier and easier to get people on board, right? So in the beginning, the number of people who are going to end up getting on board with you is going to be a low percentage hit rate of all the people you're going to talk to, because you have very little proof. And then you get thousands of users or tens of thousands of users. And now your hit rate goes from 2% of people believing you to 5%. And then you get, instead of raising $1 million of venture capital, you can raise $5 million. And so you have to build this like momentum slowly over time, and show that what you said in the beginning is actually slowly becoming reality. You have to prove that this is possible. And so I think that it's a much more of a process than it is just a one-time thing. You're always selling as an entrepreneur. I'm selling on this podcast. I'm trying to convince you, Chase, who's a total skeptic, probably I would assume, of cohort-based courses, of new models of education, because you've seen so many companies do it. And I'm here like telling you why. And we've got proof now. We've done millions of dollars of course sales. We've got thousands, tens of thousands of learners. But even that is not going to be as strong as if I come back 5 years from now and I'm like, Chase, I've actually got 2 million learners now. And Nike and Procter and Gamble and Walmart are all sending their employees through this program. So each one of those proof points will make it more and more credible and will get us further along the journey, which will allow me to sell more people, and it sort of feeds itself.
One of the things that I loved that you said was there's a building of proof that takes time. And I do think that a lot of, people who would be listening or watching right now mistake the fact of getting one person excited at one point in time to it's basically a lifetime of getting people excited about the things you're building, whether those are investors, future employees or partners or end users. And to me, that's the reason that is not talked about is because it sounds daunting, unless, and this is my point, is if you actually are living this stuff in your soul. This is the part where, this idea of, oh, do you want to work on something you're passionate about? And people say, no, that's stupid. If you work on something you're passionate about, you're going to be, sharpening pencils till the day you die, or you're going to just there's this all kinds of ephemery about like passion. And by contrast, I think if you are not actually working on something that you give a lot of shits about, I can smell it. If you're talking to me about statistics prior to getting excited about what the end user can do in 3, 5, 10 years from now, or in 4 or 5 iterations of this business, I can smell it. It's palpable. And this is why in sort of the enthusiasm is required for entrepreneurs. I do not know an entrepreneur who's not enthusiastic about, truly, genuinely in their soul about creating a thing that is not just a business idea. It is not just look good on paper, therefore I'm going to go build it and try and be the first. I do not know those people. Those people I don't think exist. And I don't think if they do, they've been successful at one time. That is not success that's repeatable. I think that's the anomaly rather than the pattern. Question for you is how do you decide what it is you're going to work on? Is it passion? Is it curiosity? Is it you find yourself staying up at night? Or you can throw rocks at my theory that it's not just a good business idea, that doesn't get a founder from, point A to point Z.
No, I agree. I think you have to have passion for it. I think there are people, for what it's worth, who have passion for money and business and not necessarily passion for the specific idea. I mean, I bet there are people who find it really hard to get excited about HR software. So if you're building HR software, you might be more excited by the visceral challenge of just running a company. And that like, so there might be some more. You and I build consumer businesses, so it's very easy to get passionate about them. And you're just, you and I both naturally lead with art and soul and a heart a little bit. So I do think there are people who are a little different, a little bit more mechanical about it, and I think that's totally fine. But there's still passion there. It's just a different type of passion. So I think no matter what, that's critical. And for me, what I think is actually most important is having the passion bar. You cannot just work on an idea because it's a good idea, or because you think you would be a good fit for it, or because you just in your heart desperately really want to be an entrepreneur because you think that's what's going to make you fulfilled. You have to actually meet the bar of, am I going to be passionate enough that when this gets really hard, I'm going to keep doing it? And that's like one of multiple bars that you have to meet to build a company. You have to have that bar. You also have to have the bar of it being a big enough vision for it to become a company. You also have to have the bar of it being possible to build. There are multiple bars, but the passion bar is one that I think is really important to hold for things that you do. Because when you commit to starting a company and you start hiring employees pretty soon, or raise investment or any of these things, pretty soon you're on a multi-year journey. And that short-term passion is going to get dissipated, and you're going to need long-term fire in your belly passion.
All right. So in that little tidbit, you talked about it getting hard. I want to get crystal for a second. So give us an example of when it got hard at Udemy. Because again, looking from the outside, you have an idea, you start it, you grow. And to be fair, with all these things, there's all kinds of market, unit economics and market economics and trends. And both you with Udemy and me with Creative Live, we were largely either writing or co-creating a universe, an ecosystem where the future of learning was going to be taught online from experts. So however you think about it, shit got hard, right? We cared a lot. We were in and up to our necks, and shit got hard. And so I'm looking for, when did it get hard, or when was it the hardest for you in particular at Udemy, and what did you do to push through it?
Yeah, it's impossible to understate how hard it actually gets, I think. And yet it's also possible to have enough perspective to realize it's really never that bad. It just feels really, really bad in the moment. But when we started Udemy, you have to understand, it was 2009, like venture capital wasn't flowing like it is today. And we had really ragtag backgrounds. My co-founders were immigrants from Turkey who went to a top tier university in Turkey that today actually has some respect amongst wise venture capitalists. But at that time, venture capitalists basically just looked at Stanford or bust. Like if you didn't go to Stanford or MIT, you just kind of weren't that interesting. And we were doing education, which no one wanted to do. So the first year and a half of Udemy was just brutal. It wasn't like, hard every once in a while. It was like hard every day. And then once in a while, like once every 6 months, we'd get some breakthrough that would just be when we were about to give up. And so the first 6 months we couldn't afford giving up our full-time jobs when we started Udemy. So the first 6 months was me trying to juggle a full-time job that was in Washington, D.C., when my co-founders were in San Francisco, flying back and forth. And so basically sleeping on red eyes and sleeping on, the flight as much as possible, while still having to be on call at my consulting job, working till 2 or 3 a.m. And then during the weekdays, and then getting to Friday, Saturday, and Sunday and trying to squeeze in another 30 to 40 hours of work there, and then doing it all over again, week after week after week, and getting nowhere, by the way, raising no money, getting no one to teach on the course, getting no one, no additional users to use the platform. We hadn't even launched the thing at this point. And that was the first 6 months. And then finally we felt like, oh, maybe, imagine doing that for 6 months, just getting your ass handed to you every day, having no credibility. So you had no confidence that this was actually going to work. And no one had done, and not no one, but very few people had started startups at that point that we had to draw upon. So there were plenty of people who had started them before us. And if they hadn't done it, I don't know if we would have had the confidence, but not that many people. And then at the end of it, we were like, shit, I can't take investor meetings on a Friday afternoon anymore when I need to, this investor wants to meet me and they're only giving me a time on Wednesday at 10. Well, at some point I had to quit my job and say, okay, well, we're going to take this leap of faith. And so this was 6 months in of getting my ass handed to me. And I still had to say, okay, well, now I've got enough traction to maybe quit my job. So maybe I could raise a financing round. And we went and did 3 weeks of fundraising. And we thought maybe in 3 to 6 weeks, we'd get a round together. And we had multiple investors say yes. And then it all fell apart. And so 6 weeks later, after quitting my job, after giving up everything, by the way, my parents didn't have money. So my mom and I really had to stretch to make things meet during this time. And my co-founders didn't come from money either. So none of us sort of could really afford to take this risk, but we took it anyways. And then it failed. And so that's the first 6 months of Udemy. It was just that. And now I didn't have a job. I was full-time on this company, but had no salary and had no revenue and no users. And when I say no users, I mean literally 0 users, because we had yet to still launch this product. And my co-founders were working full-time and supporting me. And I moved into their house. They had an extra bedroom. And we all just sort of lived together. And every day I'd wake up and I'd work on the dining room table because we couldn't afford desks or chairs or anything. We just used whatever they had. And then, 3 months went by and we finally got the product launch, and we convinced a couple of people to write articles about it. And so we got TechCrunch and Mashable and other folks to write articles about it. And then we got tens of thousands of people to show up to the website in a couple of weeks. This was amazing high. And most of them disappeared. The story, Chase. Like the big launch, and then most of them disappeared. And like a couple of weeks later, you're like, yeah, our actual user base out of all of that, I think we had 30,000 plus visitors come during that time. I think our actual user base was like 3,000 people a day. And we didn't really know, were they real users or were they just people just randomly browsing and bouncing off the site? Like mostly that, right? And then we were like, okay, well, now it's been 4 months since I quit my job. And we're starting to get in debt. I mean, we're I think $10,000 in debt. And we knew that at the speed that we were going, we'd probably be at $20,000 or $30,000 in debt in a couple months. And it was like, okay, well, we've tried this now for 10 months or so. If we can't raise money, like we're not going to be able to keep doing this. And so I and my co-founders had a conversation. We said, okay, we're going to give it until August or September, I think. And if we don't raise money by September, Gagan's going to get another job and we're going to have to try to keep going with that. Or maybe we'll shut down the company. And then we got lucky, and it took about 6 to 12 weeks to get the fundraising thing back going. Most investors had already passed on us, so they didn't even want to meet with us again. They were just like, nah, not interesting. But a couple of investors said, okay, yeah, we'll take another meeting with you. And one or two of them invested on the spot. And that completely changed everything. And all of a sudden we raised money, and we raised around $1 million. So woohoo, we could finally go and build this company. But remember, we still had very few users and we still had no revenue. And so we had raised $1 million, but $1 million only gets you so far. And now you have to go, and we spent another 6 months trying to get traction. So at this point, it's a year and a half. And finally, that's when the coding courses started to hit. And that's really when we still struggled every month, but I'd say we finally had, half of the days were highs and half the days were lows, instead of it being like 90% lows and 10% highs. And even throughout that journey, I would say after that, it still was a lot of lows, but like I'll just leave it at that. That's sort of the start of Udemy.
So to my friend Mark Cuban's statement, where getting an investor is actually a failure because you're having to sell 10 to 20% of your company to get to the next chapter, what would you respond? Cuban was sitting here with us. It's like, well, and this is ironically someone who invests a lot, and I know him as an investor first, and a human. I guess I know him as a human, but
I think that he's more right than anyone in modern day give credit for. And I almost always meet entrepreneurs and try to convince them, don't raise venture capital, like go and just build this on your own, and you can do it. And the challenges of raising venture capital are as hard as the challenges of bootstrapping it. But, here I am, Chase, and I've started 3 companies that I have raised venture capital for. So I feel a little hypocritical saying that. I think that there are certain ideas for which venture capital is the right way to go. And I think it would be very difficult to build Maven without raising money. But I think that the vast majority of people's business ideas, they would be better off not raising venture capital. And it is a bit of a failure that they raise capital, because what happens is they have a great idea and then they put it up to the standard of a venture capital fundraise, and they might get the first fundraise, but their second and third fundraise is too high of a standard and they can't meet it. And then they have to shut the company down because they've sold 20 to 30% of their company. And instead, instead of running towards this wall of venture capital, if they had just slowly skipped towards or jogged towards this wall of profitability, I think they'd be much more likely to succeed. And I think your percentage chance of success goes down dramatically when you raise venture capital. But your opportunity for success, the total size of the business goes up. Does your financial outcome go up? I don't know. I think your financial outcome is actually better still if you're bootstrapped. So it has a lot to do with what types of things you're interested in. And I think most people are better off building a business rather than raising capital.
I think this conversation here gets really interesting really quickly for, if not everybody listening, I would say 90%, because there's 10% that know this universe that we're talking about, and they've raised money, or they built a business, or they've had an opportunity to take venture capital, for example, and decided not to because of what they saw when they explored it. So let's just assume we're talking to 90% of the people there. And if you're on the other end on your jogging trail or sitting in traffic or at your desk at work or wherever you listen to podcasts, we're talking to you. So I'm guessing that there is an interesting idea that you've been kicking around. And if you take Gagan's advice, the way that I would paraphrase it is, a prototype is worth 1,000 words. You have to build something. You have to get other people excited. So let's say you've got some people excited beyond, your mom and your co-founder. You're excited about, when you bring this up at parties or at, dinners with friends, that there is a universal or a near universal leaning in saying, wow, this is actually interesting. Or I can see go back to your earlier point, I can see the big vision. Where I think it gets fascinating is our culture's obsession with raising money as a sign of victory. I threw the Cuban quote in there to sort of disrupt that belief and to get us onto this thread. And here we are. You yourself, as someone who's raised 3 times, are saying it's probably best for you to bootstrap this business because it stays less complicated. You cited a couple of different reasons. So what's the litmus test for those who are new to this whole world on whether you should bootstrap or raise?
If your business has a very high likelihood that if it works, it becomes a multi-billion-dollar company, then that is a chance of raising. Otherwise, it's important to remember that you just simply are dead in the water right there. And multi-billion-dollar company, like, let's be practical about it and actually think about, how would hundreds of millions of people use this product if it's free, or tens of millions of people pay you $10, or millions of people pay you $100 or $1,000 like per year or per month kind of thing. And like, there are examples out there that you can use to understand that. So that's the first thing. The second hurdle is, would you be happy just being an entrepreneur and being controlling your own destiny? And if the answer is yes, if that's enough, and there's always an enough, by the way, like at Maven, there's an enough. And Maven has a very low likelihood of becoming a company like Google that defines the world. Okay. I've already said that's enough. I'm not trying to become Google. I'm trying to become Airbnb or eBay or something that's maybe even smaller than that. Maybe the best case scenario of Maven, if I'm being completely honest, is something like, Masterclass or Udemy. Maybe. I think it can be a little bigger, but like, let's take that. You have to say enough at some point. If enough is $5 million, don't raise venture capital. $5 million of personal profit, don't raise venture capital. If enough is $2 million a year in profit, don't raise venture capital. Enough is, and by the way, like I would go, if I went back, Udemy was just such a great idea that I think it was worth raising venture capital for. But if I went back to Sprig, man, I would be so much more happy right now if I had started a bootstrap company second, built that up, and then maybe thought about building a venture capital business after that. And maybe I wouldn't, because if a bootstrap company, you'd own it forever and you'd just be able to keep running it. And with a venture capital company, like, I don't know what my percentage exactly is of Maven. I don't know that I'm going to share it either, but we're talking way less than 50%, right? Like I already am.
We're talking ownership percentage.
Ownership percentage of the business.
Right.
I own way less than 50%. So at this point, I am like I'm a hybrid between a hired gun who runs this company and an owner of the company. We were just filling out banking paperwork, and no one owns enough to be a beneficial owner of Maven. That's crazy. And so that's really important for people to understand is within 2.5 years, the company has already sold, in my case, way more than 50% of the business to other people, or given it away to co-founders, or given it away to employees, et cetera now. And so it's a big cost. It's a big cost.
Yeah, there's one other sort of page that I want to turn over and get clear on. And I will also confess, we can go as deep or shallow into this confession as you'd like to go, but I confess you and I had a conversation, I don't know, a few weeks ago that actually led to you being on the show here. We talked at length. I was really inspired by what it is you're building now. And I thought we could have this conversation and it would be productive. That around this, most people, we're right now, the way I'm grokking our conversations, we're trying to talk most people out of the trendy lens of raising venture capital as a cool thing to do because it sends some ego signal out to the world about how successful you are, your business could be. When in reality, 90% of businesses should not be venture backed. You were very clear on that. And I value that POV. We've also talked about one thing privately, one thing that I'd like to make public now, if you're game, which is that if you do choose the venture capital route, that there are all kinds of non-obvious things about that universe. For example, people think that when you take investors, that they want to make an awesome company. And it, of course, hinges on your definition of awesome. But if your company, for example, in 5 years is doing, $25 million and growing at, 40% year over year, I've had people
It's a failure.
I've had people say to my face that Chase, is just not interesting. And so if those kinds of numbers, again, doing 25 million a year and growing 40% year over year, to you sounds fucking bananas, off the charts, cool and successful, just know that that is not the scale that a venture capitalist is thinking. And I do not think that venture capitalism is a failure because of that. I think it's a success, but it is a success in a way that 99% of people do not understand, and that they are only interested in building totally extraordinary companies. And if you are a good company, you will actually get in their way of building radically transformative companies. So you ought to be aware of that. I was hoping to get your response.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think it's really a lot of pressure in terms of how you think about your business. There are a lot of things you cannot do that would make you profitable, or that would make you money, that you don't do because you're like, well, I could do that for to get to $2 million of revenue, but it's not along the path to get to 20. And it's definitely not along the path to get to 500. And so we make decisions all the time at Maven. I mean, Maven, look, between myself and Wes, we could run Wes is one of my co-founders, we could build courses that make $10 to $20 million a year. We know how to do that if we just built the courses ourselves. But we know that if we do that, we can only make $10 to $20 million a year. And that's, unfortunately for us, not going to be a good enough option for our venture capitalists. So we can't do that. And so we have to figure out how to scale way beyond that. And that is a whole new set of challenges that so far we haven't yet cracked all of the codes for.
Yeah.
Whereas we have right in front of us an opportunity that could make us a good amount of money. Now, the thing is, I've been fortunate enough that I've already made a good amount of money. And so I'm now playing for the next win, right? And I'm willing to take that risk, but I could spend the next 3 more years on Maven and just end up going home.
Yeah, with a zero. Yeah.
With a zero. And that happened to me with Sprig, right? I mean, technically, I've spent 15 years since I started Udemy, 3.5 of which were at Udemy. And all the money I made in my life, 100% of the money I currently own, okay, that I did not spend in living expenses, et cetera, is from Udemy. So I made all of it in 3.5 years. And the other 11.5 years was a complete waste so far. Zero. In fact, I lost money every one of those years. If you look at the net, and basically just spent my Udemy earnings during that last 11.5 years. That is crazy. That is such a crazy thing that you have to understand. And I have to be willing to do that for another 3 years. And also, by the way, being an entrepreneur is extremely expensive because you spend all your time on your business. So you can't do any home stuff. Like, we just remodeled our house and it was 3 times more expensive than it would have been if we had the time to be involved in the remodel, because we had to hire designers. We had to hire an architect. We didn't have time to do any of that shit ourselves. We had to hire people we could trust. And so it's an incredibly expensive life choice for parenting. I can't even imagine being an entrepreneur and being a parent. You have to factor that in. And I personally am willing to factor that in. And I'm lucky that I started my first company when I was 21. I had nothing to lose and just sort of like was, right place, right time, worked out. But I wouldn't encourage everyone else to do it. And there are lots of people I know who started companies at the same time who are bootstrapped. And those people are better off today than I am, for sure. Even though I built a $1 billion company and I had the success, what if I didn't? And so I would say that there's very clear, in my opinion, advice that, most of the time you want to start a bootstrap company, and every once in a while, if it's the right idea, right place, it's venture backed, and that's fine. But I wish we could change that narrative and still hold the excitement for venture backed companies that I have, because I still think there's such beauty in building the next Facebook or Google, or in our case, trying to build the next Udemy or Coursera or something like that.
Yeah, I share that that enthusiasm, and I think my goal in our conversation today is to have you share specifically your experiences having done this a few times and had great outcome, not great outcome with Sprig, which you can talk about in a second, and then again you're building another. Sort of, it's like 3 different outcomes so far and 3 different swings or 3 different at-bats. And to me, that's fascinating, because that's really, as entrepreneurs, that's what we're doing. And specifically in the venture universe, trying to help people understand that. And just, I'm going to trot out this is hyper basic. And so people who actually understand all the subtlety, bear with me. And for this is for people who don't. The way that a venture capitalist would look at, they have been given from other investors in their company. They have, let's say, $100 million, and they have to invest that over 20 companies. And so they give everybody, again, this is very crude, but they give everybody, they've got 20 companies, they got $100 million, they give everybody $5 million. Well, one of those companies, 18 of those companies go to zero. They absolutely burn out. They are not successful. One of those companies, say company 19, gives them a 5 to 20, 5 to 10, 5 to 20x return. And now there's another company that gives them $1 billion return on that 5 million. They just make all kinds of money. So if you are companies 1 through 18, prepare to be frustrated because you're going to push your business. When it doesn't meet their standards, you're going to have to shut it down or go home. When you're in that 19th business, you're going to be in no man or no woman's land. And when you're the unicorn, you are going to have a total home run. So here we are. That is what venture capitalism is. And in listening to you today, Gagan, you have done the unicorn. You've made the big bucks for your investors. You have, driven one into the ground on the back of trying to build something extraordinary with Sprig. That didn't work. You're building something new with Maven. I'm very, very excited for you with Maven. I'm hoping that you can help us sort of wrap up today by understanding, if we want to follow you on your journey with Maven, where do we go? How do we pay attention to what it is you're learning or you're building? Because the people on this listening on the show here, they want to know, they want to support.
Thanks, Chase. It's been an awesome conversation. I will say I didn't expect us to go down all the topic areas we did, but I really enjoyed it. And I hope people listening did too. The best place to find me is on LinkedIn or Twitter, Gagan Biyani, or Maven, maven.com, Maven.com. So yeah, basically, we're going to do our best to build the university of the future. We're going to try to help people out there learn skills that they need to in their jobs, in their careers, learn management, learn sales, etc., but in a way that we think is a lot more effective than the old school version of education. So I hope you'll come and check it out and find a course that might be valuable for you and make a big difference on your journey. Thank you so much, Chase.
Yeah, happy to have you on the show. And I will wrap up by saying you indicated that I might be a skeptic. I'm not a skeptic. I'm very, very passionate about what you're building. I think to be able to learn with others is an incredibly helpful, adaptive, sort of creative way of looking at learning. And I do think that's a huge piece of the future, whether you're doing that in a cohort where everyone's online or you're doing some bit of in-person or some bit of online, some bit of synchronous and asynchronous. I think the combination, like all things, it's really gray. And so I'm very excited about what you're building. Not a skeptic here, just a big fan, and congrats on all the success. And I'm pulling for you with Maven, and I'll encourage our audience to go check it out. So thank you very much, man. I appreciate you and your time for sharing your insights around what it's like to be a lifelong entrepreneur. More power to you, my man.
Thanks, Chase.